So say you're engaged to create a learning campaign for an organisation at a very high level. Can you talk us through some of the key steps in your approach?
Yeah, look, and I suppose that's come from practice or finding out what works well and what doesn't work well. But I think an obvious first step is to find out what's really required and why. Mm-hmm. What are the needs and goals? What are the gaps perhaps in current provision or the approach that's already used? Mm-hmm. It's important to focus on, well, what would success look like? So that you can design for success. Mm-hmm. What resources will be available to support that learning campaign? Mm-hmm. Then obviously it's moving on to actually drafting something up, mm-hmm. drafting a design of that new campaign and demonstrating to perhaps the decision makers how it will work, why it will get the results that's necessary, what will it take to implement that campaign well. Mm-hmm. And then obviously you need agreement from those decision makers to say, yeah, go ahead with this. Mm-hmm. But I think an important part of that for me is identifying who are going to be the senior advocates that will champion that campaign really well. That leaders really need to start walking the walk if a campaign is to work well. It's not to say, well, we initiated it. Aren't we great? We came up with it and the idea that was necessary. Well, no, they need to do it. They need to be the leaders of it. They need to really champion it if it's going to work really well. And once you've got that, you've got people working with you to develop that campaign appropriately with all the required assets that are necessary perhaps to be built as part of that. But something I think is really missed often is a really good implementation plan. And it's great to have a fantastic product or campaign or approach to something. But if you don't really know how you're going to plan it, what's the clear and workable framework? What's the timetable? And what are the identified milestones within that? Understanding the costs and other implications that are around that, the risks that might well be involved. And as part of that plan, having really effective and appropriate communication. You'll need to develop that to introduce your staff to that campaign, to convince the staff about that campaign, why it's going to be good for them. As learners, what they're going to get out of that campaign, how will it make them more effective in their roles, provide a better experience for them and for their colleagues sort of around them. So I think that's really an important part of implementation. But then I think when you're doing the campaign itself is having some defined touch points along the way as the rollout's ongoing. Otherwise, how do you know how the campaign is progressing? And I would always suggest to an organisation that go for a prototype, a piloting approach. For a particularly large campaign, I think that's really important to be considered. And then seeing how that works and then go for a larger rollout, or maybe just a soft rollout first of all, within a harder part of the campaign, but led again by that leadership. And then a last step for me is development of an evaluation plan. Look at the outcomes, look at the impacts. How can you improve the experience for those who are part of that campaign, and then adapt as necessary and encourage further follow-up so that it doesn't again become a sporadic one-time affair. It does start to change the culture for that particular area of learning that was necessary or behavioural change.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So you've kind of got that four-step approach. So there's almost like a needs analysis into a design, into implementation, into kind of review. And the implementation, and I think in some respects, my observations, both in organizations I've worked in, but with talking to our client partners, is that, and as you've alluded to there, is that implementation is the most difficult. And that's because that's where the humans become involved. You know, like if you've got the needs analysis and the design, the people involved at that point are willing and active participants who are part of that process. And in some respects, review and analysis as well is people actively, L&D people or management involved in that process. But it's the implementation where you've got every person in the organization who's expected to come along for the ride. And you're so right. I think that can be, just not given the weight that it deserves. And if it's not done right, and listening to you, you're absolutely right. There almost needs to be an advertising campaign, like a comms campaign, but it needs to almost go beyond that. You're persuading people.
Absolutely.
You're persuading the people of your organization to think that this is a good idea, it's needed, and that they should come along for the ride. And I think yeah, there's a huge body of work involved in that.
Yeah, and I think if the staff therefore realise the change is necessary, they'll be on board with it.
Yeah.
Often we're told change is necessary without convincing people why. And that's why they don't want to come along and see it as an imposition. But I really liked your point about the humans and being part of those parts of the process. But I take that back even further to the design process, human design focused, in terms of they'll be able to tell you whether it's going to be able to be implemented if they're part of actually the design of what you're trying to produce. So I think a failure to involve people early on, failure in outcomes often.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess because then people will feel they've had their voice heard, and they'll feel part of that process. So an organization could almost sort of say, look, we're about to organize this new or develop a new suite of learning around process A. Who wants to be involved? And you could almost put it out to organization, couldn't you? And say, next week at this time, we're going to have a forum and we're going to talk about it. And then if people don't get involved, but then complain about it later, then, or don't respond correctly to it later, you can kind of, you've given them an opportunity to kind of be involved in the process. And I think then it's that sort of collaborative approach, which will then give people buy-in and feel a sense of ownership over the learning, which hopefully will lead to them kind of really being engaged with it.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical word, Jules. I think the ownership piece I think is really critical for anything to work.
Yeah, absolutely.